Hi, everyone. Welcome to Race and Ethnic Relations. This is the fifth week of our 6-week course, so we're starting to wrap things up. And I want to spend today talking with you about mass incarceration, race and ethnicity, and the school to prison pipeline. So we're going to start by reflecting on what we learned last week. And I'd like you, as an exercise, without looking back at your notes, to try to answer the following questions. What are middleman minorities? I'd like you to explain the differences among pluralism, multiculturalism, and interculturalism as theories. And I'd like you to define the myth of the model minority and why it's harmful. Specifically, I'd like you to give 3 reasons that Chow and Fagan say the myth of the model minority is harmful. So today we're going to be talking about race and mass incarceration. So what do we mean by mass incarceration? We often hear about it as just a buzzword to talk about prison systems as they relate to race and ethnicity. It's important to recognize that our current system of incarcerating people as punishment for a crime isn't really that old. Until about the 1890s, prisonization or incarceration of people as punishment for crimes wasn't very common in the United States or even in England. Incarceration was very much done to hold people who are awaiting trial, who would then receive a sentence, usually to either, a fine or in some cases the death penalty, or in some cases a period of labor. But most of the time in the United States until the 1890s or so, people were not put into prison as punishment for a crime. They were put into prison to await trial. And then after their sentence was carried out, they were free. We actually have the Quakers to thank for our current system of incarceration. They created what they called the penitentiary as an idea. Quaker thinkers proposed that humans, being essentially good, if put in a quiet place and given an opportunity to reflect pensively on their crimes, would become penitent. That is, they would become remorseful and they would reintegrate into society. So with this kind of Enlightenment thinking of incarceration as essentially a treatment for crime, we started to have the first prisons in the United States that were meant to, as a sentence in themselves. People would be sentenced to a period of incarceration in a penitentiary. This system really prevailed in the North, but at the same time that we had this trend in our law system of incarcerating people as a punishment, we started to see the rise of prison farms in the South. With the end of slavery, we had the Reconstruction of the South and the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery except as punishment for a crime. Well, the Southern economy was absolutely devastated by the Civil War. The Northern economy was severely impacted, but the Southern agrarian agriculture, plantation agriculture system was absolutely shot. It was no more. It relied upon forced or drastically underpaid labor to make it work. So a strategy employed by Southern states was to essentially create new crimes of which black people and poor white people could be easily convicted and then sentenced to periods on work farms or prison farms. Prison farms were often plantations by another name. For an historical example of this, see Angola Plantation in Carvel, Louisiana. Carvel Plantation or Carvel, Louisiana is named after the Carvel family of if you look at the economic kind of advisor or pundit, James Carville, that's his family. And it's called Angola Plantation because it was named after the African people who were enslaved there. They came largely from Angola. And at the time, Angolan slaves were a particular status symbol because they were considered the best workers. So Angola Plantation was a plantation in Carville, Louisiana, owned by the Carville family. And after the Civil War, it became Angola Prison Farm. It was essentially the same industry, the same growing strategy, but instead of being worked by enslaved African people, it was worked by incarcerated criminals. After the prison farm was no longer profitable, it became a leper colony. It became a sanitarium for people diagnosed with leprosy. And today it's a restored historical site, which recognizes both its plantation past, its prison past, and its sanitarium past. So today we're going to talk about some of the disparities in incarceration, the mechanisms of mass incarceration, and some of the community impacts of mass incarceration. So when we talk about disparities in mass incarceration, although most people just kind of connect the idea of race with the term mass incarceration, it's important to understand that white people are mass incarcerated too. However, incarceration disproportionately affects men of color, especially black men. So mass incarceration has grown in the United States despite falling crime rates. So the chart on the left shows from 1925 to 2019 how the federal prison system, state and federal prison population has changed. And you'll see that in 1925, fewer than 200,000 people, really fewer than 100,000 people were incarcerated in state and federal prisons. But by 2019, it was 1,380,427 people. And you see kind of a steady incline with a couple of little dips until about the late 70s. And then from about 1972 onward, we see a sharp increase. So we'll talk more about that in a moment, but I want you to notice that trend. Notice, so this chart is a little bit truncated. This is actually from 1990 to 2019. The chart on the right with the blue line. And what you'll see here is notice what's happening on the chart on the left. Here's 1990. We're seeing a meteoric rise in prison populations. But if you look at reported violent crime rates in the United States, that is non-drug and non-property crime, you see that it's sharply and steadily declining at the same period. So we're going to talk more about this in a minute. Of course, one theoretical implication here could be that because incarceration rates are rising, we're getting violent criminals off the streets and crime rates are falling. I'm going to argue that that's not the case. So the reason I'll argue that that's not the case, that removing kind of violent offenders from the streets isn't responsible for driving down violent crime rates, is because there's no correlation between the two. So most of this growth, and if you look at the whole pie, prison system, the whole pie article that I assigned for this week, you'll see that most prison system growth is actually driven by pre-trial detention, immigrant detention, and nonviolent drug offenses. So there's no reason to think that violent crime rates are going down because we've locked more people up, because the people we're locking up are by and large not violent criminals. What I'm arguing by showing these two charts in tandem like this is actually that the more crime rates drop, the more we create kind of narratives of moral panic that drive tough on crime politics. So we'll talk about that more in a moment. I also want to point out the racial and ethnic disparities in mass incarceration. Now, it's worth noting that almost equal numbers of black and white men are incarcerated. But that's a misleading statistic because black and white men are not equally represented in the non-prison population. In fact, white people make up almost 70% of the United States population, while black people make up between 13 and 17%. So if you look at the chart I've provided on the right, which is based on state and federal prison populations of people 18 years and older from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, you'll see that black men are incarcerated at a rate of 2,000 per 100,000 residents, where white men are incarcerated at just 385 persons per 100,000 population. So looking at it proportionally, I think this headline is really misleading. Black incarceration rates are dropping. Yes, that is absolutely true. However, they're dropping to still be about 6 times higher than white incarceration rates. The trend is more obvious in actual declining black incarceration rates among women, but it's still stark. We still have black women incarcerated at twice the rate of white women. Now, a common argument that we hear when faced with statistics like these are perhaps this represents a legitimate difference in offending. But the next slide shows that that's really not true. So this comes also from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and shows that this is a little hard to parse, but if you look at the first row, or at the first rows, sold drugs, committed violence, you see that white people are actually more likely than black people to sell drugs and just about as likely to commit violence. With Latino people in each instance having a different pattern. So Latino people are between black and white people in terms of selling drugs and lower than both groups for violence. But if you look at the risk of arrest and felony conviction, you see that for black people, it's significantly higher. Black people and Latino people are more likely to be arrested, and black people are almost 3 times more likely to get a felony conviction. And they're 5 times as likely to be incarcerated. So if you look at imprisonment rates in jail, that's like county lockup, local jails. You see that white people have a 0.2 chance of being incarcerated, while black people have a 1.5% chance. Same with prison. Again, black people are far more likely to be sentenced to prison and to probation. So racial disparities in incarceration are not driven by differences in offending. They're also not driven by economic differences, which is what a lot of people argue, is that incarceration differences are driven, that essentially race becomes a proxy for class. That race, when we say race differences, what we're really measuring are class differences. That black people just on average are so much more economically disadvantaged that they can't afford to participate in a legal process in advantageous ways, and thus are more likely to be incarcerated. But what we find is that that's not a true driver either. The sons of black families from the top 1% of earners had about the same chance of being incarcerated on a given day as the sons of white families earning $36,000 a year, which is near poverty. So we see that actually black people, especially black men, who are the wealthiest of black men, are still just about as likely to be incarcerated as white men living near poverty. So we're not seeing differences driven by economic differences, which leads most sociologists to assume that there are actual differences by race occurring, that the occurrence of mass incarceration of black men is actually racially driven. So we're going to talk about what sociologists think some of those mechanisms of mass incarceration are. And we're going to talk pretty extensively about the criminalization of racialized groups. We're also going to talk about the school-to-prison pipeline, as described in the Ijeoma Oluo article chapter that I assigned this week. So when we talk about the criminalization of racialized groups, what we mean is our country's history of making laws that specifically were targeted to penalize racialized minority groups. So a really good example of this is racialized drug laws. So our first drug laws in the United States, if you recall back to last week, in the 1880s, 1890s, we were in a pretty severe economic recession as a country. And Chinese Americans were being scapegoated to a large degree for the economic problems of the country. They were also being criminalized in a lot of ways. And one of the ways we could criminalize Chinese American people was to make laws against opium use. Opium dens or opium houses were the crack houses of their day. Opium is a drug that was smoked, and it was primarily used by Asian people who brought it to the United States and basically opened opium bars, places where people could come in, use opium, and spend time. And opium is highly addictive. It's essentially heroin. It's very addictive. And people were really going broke and getting sick from it. But a lot of the people going broke and getting sick were white people who were unfamiliar with the use of opium, and it became kind of a scapegoat for a lot of societal problems. So laws were passed banning the use of opium in the 1890s, and those were really our first drug laws. In the 1930s and 40s, we did the same thing with cocaine, which was strongly associated with black Americans, particularly black men, and with jazz music. Finally, in the 1960s and 70s, we started making laws in the 1930s and 40s also, we started making laws about marijuana, but those were greatly expanded in the 60s and 70s for reasons we'll talk about later. And of course, those laws were intended to target Mexican Americans. So when we talk about the drug war, we're really talking about a raft of policies that started in the 60s and 70s, largely under the Nixon administration. And this is a quote, so that you don't think I'm making this up. This is a quote by John Ehrlichman, who was an aide to President Nixon. And he essentially discussed the ways in which drug laws were created to vilify political enemies. And what he said was, you want to know what this is really all about. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So this is a pretty damning quote by someone involved in the administration, responsible for criminalizing to a large degree marijuana and heroin in particular. But this raft of policies ended up being very popular, and subsequent politicians really just doubled down on it. So in the 1980s, with the rise of President Reagan, we saw the drug war and tough on crime politics really ramp up. So Nixon started the war on drugs. Reagan made it great. Reagan increased penalties for drugs and ramped up policing to prosecute drug crimes. And he did this for several reasons. For one thing, as the 70s ended, overtly racist language in politics was becoming risky. You couldn't alienate, with the end of voter suppression laws in the 1960s and early 70s, even conservative politicians who had typically counted just on white voters began really courting votes in communities of color. So it became politically risky to say, we want to criminalize black communities, or we want to criminalize our political opponents, and instead politicians shifted gears to talk about inner city crime and poverty. They made crime and poverty the problem rather than the people in the cities and living with crime and poverty. Some catchwords for these kinds of policies were law and order politics and tough on crime politics. These are what we call political dog whistles, meaning people listening who were from the kind of old political guard understood what was being said. They understood what was meant. They understood that what was meant was that the political party was going to prosecute crimes in the way they had traditionally been prosecuted, and that they were going to put a lot of emphasis on the criminal justice system as a means for solving social problems. But for people who were untrained to listen for these kinds of whistles, it just sounded like, yeah, we're going to make communities safer. So under the Reagan administration, a lot more funding was given to police. A lot more funding was given to local police departments to uphold federal drug laws. And there was increased support for incarceration as punishment for drug use and drug possession and drug selling through things like mandatory minimum sentences, 3-strike laws, etc. Mandatory minimums mean that certain crimes, especially drug crimes, carry a sentence that judges can't go beneath. So if the mandatory minimum is 3 years, a judge has to sentence you to at least 3 years, but can sentence you to more. And 3-strike laws mean that if you have 3 of a certain kind of offense, you're in prison for life. So in addition to drug crime, we also have a national history of criminalizing especially black men by portraying them as predators, as dangerous, violent, troublemakers, etc. And as early as Reconstruction, with the film The Birth of a Nation, which is largely credited with the reinvention of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s and 30s. Following Reconstruction, and you've got to think, Reconstruction was 1880s through 1890s. 1920s and 30s was 20, 30 years after that. So a generation after Reconstruction, black men were really portrayed as sexual predators. Birth of a Nation, for those who haven't seen it, and I, can't recommend seeing it, is about the Klan cracking down on and defending white women from black rapists. during the Great Depression, black men were seen as vagrants, as hobos, and as job thieves. So a lot of the same language from the 1870s and 1880s Depression against Chinese men were now deployed against black men. That black men were traveling from town to town, working jobs that white people didn't want to do for lower pay, and undercutting white men and essentially taking their jobs. During the World War I, World War II, and interwar period, we saw kind of a focusing outward rather than focusing inward on criminalizing black men, although many of the same trends and tropes continued. But we don't have any kind of really new kinds of criminalization of black men. But in the 1950s and 60s, as World War II ended, and as internal political strife, especially protests around civil rights, started to ramp up, we saw black men increasingly portrayed as political troublemakers, as violent criminals, and as mentally ill. There was actually a syndrome described by psychiatrists at the time called protest psychosis, which essentially said that black men and women, to a lesser degree, were en masse becoming psychotic with delusions of being politically oppressed, and that it was leading to paranoid schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. And that these men, when mentally ill, were especially violent and combative. In the 1970s and 80s, black men as drug dealers, gang members, and urban criminals, with tough on crime, law and order politics, and the new focus on the inner city, really prevailed. And by the 1990s and 2000s, we had black men portrayed as urban super predators. Essentially, people so desensitized to crime, poverty, and violence that they no longer had a conscience that would tend to prevent them committing crimes. I've linked to a video clip here, which you can click through in the slides. But essentially, it's a political personality describing super predators, and it may not be who you think. So this is an example of protest psychosis. This is one of the earliest ads for Haldol, which is a antipsychotic drug that's typically injected and is typically considered a kind of chemical restraint. It makes people very passive. It makes people very agreeable. It often makes people somewhat catatonic. They tend not to be able to make good decisions for themselves and to pretty much just do whatever you suggest that they do. And it's very fast acting. It can be given through an intramuscular injection, usually in the hip or thigh, and just makes people very calm and passive pretty much at once. And here we see a black man in kind of urban wear. This is from the 70s. Wearing, kind of stereotypically black urban clothing. His hair looks wild, and it says assaultive and belligerent. Cooperation often begins with Haldol. So, yes, it's suggesting that this might be a good way to start therapy. But the image is of subduing a black criminal. So now that we've talked about the criminalization of people of color in general, with a focus on criminalizing drugs and criminalizing black men as a group, I want to talk about how this plays out in the school setting. And I think this is important to talk about the school to prison pipeline for a couple of reasons. First is that the school to prison pipeline illustrates how multiple systems, even ostensibly beneficial systems, can actually work together and play into each other to create structural racism but also how interpersonal and kind of old-fashioned racism can play out in a structural setting. So although we've been focusing on structural racism in this course, and I think that's appropriate, it's also important to acknowledge that individual and interpersonal biases still exist, and that structures are shaped and enforced by human beings. So the school to prison pipeline, as outlined in the chapter you read from Ijeoma Oluo, includes several things. First of all, Black children and brown children, including Latinx children and including children of mixed ethnicity and mixed race, are more likely to be subjected to out-of-school suspension and expulsion, which are more likely to create interactions with law enforcement. If you're suspended or expelled from school, what are you going to do all day? You can't go to school. You can't get a job. What are you going to do? You're going to sit at home or stay in your neighborhood, and children who are bored and unsupervised often get into trouble. So out-of-school suspension and expulsion not only disrupt education, putting children behind when they return to school, but they also create more interactions with law enforcement. Children are playing outside unsupervised. Children are frequenting local businesses unsupervised. They may get into additional trouble. And this is true for any child left unsupervised, especially a child dealing with behavioral difficulty. But we see that these specific punishments are way more often meted out to Black and brown children, especially boys. We also see that Black and brown children are much more likely to be tracked into special education and alternative schools, which work together to make school completion less likely. If you are a child who has special educational needs and can't learn in a typically structured classroom, special education is a wonderful thing, and should be given as much resources as possible. But what's been shown to happen is that Black and brown children who simply have behavioral difficulty because of stress or because of kind of normal childhood experiences are more likely to be diagnosed with a learning disability or a mental illness, and thus put into special education when that's not really the most appropriate thing for them. Similarly, children who are Black and brown are more likely to be sent to alternative schools, especially after a suspension or an expulsion. And we know from educational data that once a child is sent to alternative school, they become much less likely to complete high school. This is a simple point, but it's very important to make, is that harsher in-school discipline creates alienation. That if you're constantly being told that you're bad, that you're acting up, that you're not doing right, that you don't learn like other children, and you're getting messages from teachers that you're just a problem to deal with, how are you going to feel at school? Are you going to feel that school is for you? Are you going to feel that school is an environment where you fit in, where you thrive, where you're supposed to succeed? Or are you going to feel frustrated, burdened, and burned out on school? So harsher school discipline doesn't just disrupt education in kind of a logistical way. It also creates psychological distress and alienation from school. And this would be true no matter who it happened to. But we know that it disproportionately happens to Black and brown children. Finally, the advent of the kind of school resource officer. This really started happening in the early 2000s, that police officers and sometimes even entire police precincts were set up inside mostly urban schools to ostensibly to keep children safe in the case of a school shooting incident. But we know that, thank goodness, school shootings are fairly rare. Of course, any school shooting is too many, but we know that they're comparatively rare. So if you're a police officer in a school and your job is to keep students safe, but there are no external threats, the tendency is to look for internal threats to safety, to look at other students within the school who are maybe not committing violent crime or threatening violent crime, and to see them as challenges to order and to safety. So school resource officers are often employed to kind of police behavior within a school. And we know that in schools with resource officers, teachers and administrators are more likely to involve law enforcement to deal with what we might consider kind of an ordinary behavioral problem. So two children are fighting. If there's no school resource officer, a teacher separates them or calls an administrator to separate them. But if there is a resource officer present, then the resource officer may be called to respond to that incident. And what we know is that if a police officer responds to an incident, they tend to bring criminal charges or bring the criminal legal system to bear. So that ends up with things like the case described in the Aluo chapter, but also there was a case of a 6-year-old girl in Florida. It's been about 3 years ago now, who was coloring on her desk with a pencil, and the teacher told her to stop, and she refused to stop. And so the school resource officer was called and led her out in handcuffs and charged her with destruction of government property. So what we know is that when we involve police officers in what are essentially ordinary childhood behaviors, even if the behaviors are challenging, they're not threatening, they're not dangerous, they're not inherently criminal. We end up bringing children in contact with the legal system earlier, and in ways that disrupt their education. So finally, I want to talk about some community impacts of mass incarceration. Specifically, I want us to talk about the idea of secondary prisonization, the economic impact on communities of color from mass incarceration, and the psychological impact on families, communities, and individuals. So the term secondary prisonization is a sociological concept of how people who are close to someone who's incarcerated end up suffering ill effects of that person's incarceration and end up essentially having their lives dictated by the carceral system. So mass incarceration fractures families, leading to often single parenting and disruption of care. 1 in 3 Black men will be incarcerated at some point in their lives, compared to about 1 in 10 white men. If you have a parent in prison, you may be cared for by the other parent. You may also be cared for by grandparents. If that's the case, this may lead to disruption in your care as a child. Your single parent may have to work, which means you may be cared for all day by a grandparent, which is well and good as long as the grandparent is able and willing to care for you. But then when the grandparent becomes old, who cares for the grandparent? Who takes care of you if someone is sick? Who takes care of you if you're really sick? Who kind of makes up the difference if there's a job loss? So it disrupts families, it leads to single parenting, and often to disruption of care for children, for elders, and for other vulnerable folks. Families' lives are often dictated by the strictures of the criminal legal system. So what happens after your incarcerated parent gets out of prison? You may want to reunite that family and keep that family together. But families with a convicted felon living in them are often ineligible for subsidized housing, which many families rely on. They may be ineligible to live in certain neighborhoods or certain housing developments. And they may be ineligible for other government benefits such as SNAP or food stamps, and such as Medicaid. So Finally, because of a criminal history, families can be denied housing altogether. A lot of landlords will simply not rent to someone who's been incarcerated, regardless of why or for how long. So it can create a permanent fracture in families as the formerly incarcerated person doesn't want to bring their whole family down. But it can also create major hardships for families who do reunite. And finally, it's impossible to estimate accurately the economic impact that incarceration has on communities of color. So, if 1 in 3 Black men will be incarcerated in his lifetime, this represents often a disruption in education if the person is incarcerated as a youth or a child. Disrupted earning potential. For a really great illustration of this, see the article entitled The Mark of a Criminal Record by Diva Pager, who found that not only were people who had been incarcerated less likely to be hired for a job than people who had never been incarcerated, Black men were more likely to be passed over for a job regardless of criminal history, and the impact of a criminal history was much harder on Black men than white men. It also makes people ineligible for many jobs. So one major move that a lot of anti-mass incarceration activists are calling for is what's called banning the box, essentially making it illegal for hirers, for employers, to ask about criminal history where it's not relevant to the ability to do the job. Of course, it makes sense to ask about criminal history if you're hiring someone as a child care worker, an elder care worker, or to work in law enforcement. But it may make much less sense if they're applying for a job at the Home Depot Garden Center. So an additional consequence of mass incarceration that we don't often talk about is that it leads to massive voter disenfranchisement. So many people who are convicted of felonies are disenfranchised from voting for the rest of their lives. And even if they're convicted of a misdemeanor or convicted of a lesser crime, they may be ineligible to vote the entire time they're incarcerated and for some period after that while they're under supervision, like probation or parole. So voter disenfranchisement is a major consequence of mass incarceration that makes it very difficult for people affected by mass incarceration and their families to advocate for change. So that finally, I want us to talk about the psychological impact. This is much more difficult to quantify and to say, here are the consequences. But we know that we live in a system where people of color are more likely to fall afoul of the law for reasons that are not necessarily in their control, that don't have to do with differences in offending, that don't have to do with moral failings. But nonetheless, this system harms their family and community connections. We hold a lot of stigma associated with having been incarcerated, and it's impossible to estimate to what degree incarceration creates trauma and reshapes a person's worldview. So what we know is that incarceration is not especially effective as a punishment for crime or as a crime deterrent. That if the goal is to punish someone, that is to cause them to suffer in recompense for having committed a crime, mass incarceration is very effective. It certainly traumatizes and harms people. But recidivism rates are very high. And there's no reason to think that putting people in prison actually makes communities safer. What it does, in fact, is put someone in the mindset of being in a prison. of being constantly watched, constantly supervised, constantly surrounded by reminders of their failing, and by other people who share the same kinds of hardships and behavioral challenges that they themselves are dealing with, reinforces kind of fear and anger, and reshapes worldviews to include things like learned helplessness. If you are incarcerated for something you didn't do, remember we saw that many people who are incarcerated are in jail pre-trial. So they haven't necessarily been convicted of anything. They just can't afford cash bail. So imagine knowing that you've been wrongfully arrested and you spend a year or more in jail awaiting trial, and then you're cleared of all charges. That doesn't change the fact that you just lost a year of your life to prison, sometimes more. This causes emotional trauma and reshapes people's worldviews about society. So it's important to understand that while mass incarceration affects communities and economies, it also affects individual persons and spirits. So if you have any questions about the topic of mass incarceration or the school to prison pipeline, please email me. That also applies if you just have questions about the course that you need to clear up. Next week will be our last week. So if you have any questions about anything, this is a good time to get in touch. Looking forward, next week is our final week. So exam 2 will be sent out on Tuesday and will be due on Friday. And your final reflection paper will be due on Friday. And we can talk more about that on Thursday. So please let me know if you have any questions or if there's anything I can do to help you. All right. Have a wonderful day, everyone.